Sports shape lives, build communities, and drive billion-dollar industries. Yet their true impact often goes unnoticed.
From personal growth and well being to career potential, it's time to rethink what sports can do. This is the Why Not Sports Podcast. Welcome to the Why Not Sports Podcast, a podcast where we dive into the business and community side of sports. Today, we are super honored to welcome Kristi Dosh.
Kristi Dosh is a sports attorney, analyst, and one of the foremost experts on the business of college athletics. She began her career as a practicing attorney before transitioning into sports media writing for ESPN, The Washington Post, Sports Business Journal, and currently Forbes. After joining ESPN as its first female full-time sports business reporter, Kristi became a go-to expert on the financial and legal aspects of college sports. She has since consulted with athletic departments, universities, and NIL collectives on strategy, policy, and conference realignment. Kristi is also a successful author, having written Saturday Millionaires: How Winning Football Builds Winning Colleges, and her upcoming book, The Athlete's NIL Playbook, which is set for release in July of 2025. Recognized for her objective and insightful analysis, Kristi has been featured on major networks and publications, helping athletes, universities, and businesses navigate the evolving landscape of college and pro sports.
Kristi, welcome to the show.
Thanks. You guys made me sound good. Appreciate it.
No, absolutely. That's what an insane career. And Kristi, kind of like the questions that we'd like to start off with is what's your sports story?
Yeah, so I got here in a sort of strange way. People are always like, "Oh, how can I get where you are?" My path is not, not one I would say you could follow because I never really intended to be in this position. I never thought about being a journalist or about reporting on the business side of college sports. I wanted to be a lawyer my whole life, but I was a huge sports fan. I grew up in Atlanta when the Braves went from worst to first in the early 1990s, and I'm a huge baseball fan. It's my favorite sport as a fan. But as I started writing about legal and business issues in sports, it was really just for fun. During law school, I had a few papers I wrote for law school classes where I focused on sports just because that's what was interesting for me to research, and got really interested in collective bargaining at first. So I was writing about baseball and football and basketball. And then I wrote a series of blogs about the finances of college sports. And this would have been in 2009 or so. And that was right as conference realignment, that round at least, it was heating up. And I started writing about sort of the financial motivations for conference realignment. And it just wasn't something a lot of people were writing about back then. I mean, I feel like everyone writes about it now, but I was able to sort of get in when no one else was doing that. And so I was practicing law full time, nothing related to sports at all. I was a corporate attorney. I did tax credit work, but I was writing on the side about legal issues and business issues. And as I transitioned into doing that more for college sports, it sort of took off for me, and I got more media opportunities and opportunities to write for bigger publications. And then it's a much longer story than this, but after a couple of years of doing that, I did get a full-time job offer from ESPN to be their sports business reporter. And that's not something I applied for or that I ever envisioned myself doing, but it really did change the course of my career. I've never gone back to practicing law, and instead I have just become more and more involved in the business side of college sports.
How do you navigate making such a big change like that, right? Like you grew up wanting to be a lawyer, you became a lawyer, and then you kind of switched into this new atmosphere. Like this, was it kind of like intuitively, or how did you make that change in the first place?
No, it's interesting because looking back, I thought that the sports dream was over. When I was in law school, I applied for a lot of jobs in the sports space as an attorney and thought like that would be ideal if I could do something related to sports and still be a lawyer. But it's really hard to get a job in sports straight out of law school. Most people go work for a firm first, they sort of make connections there, and then they go inside to work with a sports organization. So I interned with the WTA, the Women's Tennis Tour, and had a great experience there, but didn't have a full-time job offer. Ended up at a big law firm in Atlanta, kind of doing my backup plan, which was corporate law. And when I took that job at the big firm in Atlanta, I thought that was the end of my potential sports law career because I didn't go to a firm that had a sports practice, or at least they didn't at that time. I think they do now, but I thought that was the end of it. But I had started blogging in law school, like 2004, 2005, and did it just for fun. It was 100% just a creative outlet. I wasn't making any money on it. I didn't even know how to make money on it at that point in time. It was just for fun. And The legal practice area I was in got hit really hard during the downturn in 09, 10, around that time. And so I found myself with more time to blog, and sort of the more I blogged, the more opportunities I got. And that's what sort of grew into the eventual job offer from ESPN. So it wasn't something I saw coming. Like I said, I didn't apply. I knew an agent who wasn't even my agent. He was just an agent who knew me, and he was at ESPN, and he brought up my name to them, and they recognized my name because I was getting linked to and quoted to by their writers quite a bit. And they asked me if I wanted to come up and meet with them. And I didn't even know I was interviewing for a job. I thought it was just like a networking opportunity, and it turned into a job. So it was kind of a surprise shift in my career, but changed the course of my entire career for the better.
Yeah, so kind of as a pioneer who created your own niche covering sports business, what were some challenges that you faced early on trying to get as much adoption as possible from the mainstream that may not be super aware or interested in that subject?
Yeah, honestly, until I got hired by ESPN, the hardest thing was just getting eyeballs on my work. I was blogging on my own site, and then I'd gotten the opportunity to guest blog for some other sites. And eventually that led me to a connection that got me on at Forbes as a sports business contributor there. I'm actually on my second go round with them now, but I was with them for the better part of 2 years before I went to ESPN. It paid nothing. It was just a way to sort of get your name out there and be on a larger platform. And certainly that work did wonderful things for me. But that was the hardest thing, was just getting your work in front of people. That was the early days of Twitter, which I guess is now X. I still call it Twitter because I'm old and I got on when it was Twitter.
We
But
call it
I
Twitter.
remember what my first book publisher was like, you got to be on Twitter. And I was like, to do what? Like share my dinner? Like that's what people were doing. They were sharing food photos. Like in the early
Yeah.
days of Twitter, it was the most like mundane stuff. But actually, I made the most incredible connections in the early days on Twitter with other journalists who invited me to guest blog or who quoted me in their articles and linked to my website. And really, I think I owe a lot of my career to the early days of Twitter and that ability to connect with other journalists in the space.
Yeah, that definitely overlaps with one of the big kind of talking points that we've heard from individuals in the sports industry is the importance of relationship building and developing these strong connections as they end up paying dividends in the long run. What would you give advice for in that regard to people that are kind of starting their way in the career now?
Yeah, what I always tell people is no one teaches you how to network. Some people just naturally are good at it because, they're extroverted. I'm a little bit on that end of the scale. I'll go up and talk to anybody, at an event in person. But what people do is they go to these events and they collect business cards, and then they go home and they do nothing. Really early on, somebody actually in my first law firm, somebody that I met taught me that to take the business card as soon as I walk away from the person, to scribble down something I remembered about them or about our conversation on the back of it. And now like people are doing QR codes on their phone and stuff. I don't know how I'm going to make this work anymore, but it used to be I would have the physical card and I would write myself a little note. And then when I got home, I would connect with them on LinkedIn. I would send them an email if it was somebody I wanted to stay in touch with. And I would remind them what we talked about. I would be like, it was so nice seeing you at MLB winter meetings. Really enjoyed talking to you about, the 91 Braves team, whatever it was we talked about. I'd love to stay in touch. And I would sort of find excuses to stay in touch with people. And LinkedIn is great for that still, even now, years later, because once you're connected with somebody on LinkedIn, you're going to see their stuff show up in your feed. You're going to see when they, get a promotion and they have a new job title, or they change companies, or they publish an article and they share it. And that gives you opportunities to reach out to them and say, congratulations, or hey, I read what you wrote and I really enjoyed it. That's how you build connection. You can't just meet somebody once and say, well, I got their business card. You've got to work to grow the relationship, and you need to grow it before you start asking for anything. I think one of the biggest mistakes I see, especially from younger people, is first time they reach out to me, they're asking for something, and I don't know anything about them yet, and they're asking me to make an introduction for them, or to help them with an internship, or to tell them where to look for internships. And it's like, I don't know anything about you yet. Like, you need to build a little bit of a connection before I can help you, and then I would love to help you. So I just think it's important to put the work in on those connections.
Absolutely. And kind of switching into more a little bit about your career. So you have gone into law, journalism, and sports business, and you kind of been at the intersection of all of those things. So what first drew you to that intersection, of law and college athletics?
I think I realize now about every position I've had, including when I was a lawyer, is I love to write. Like, my job has to primarily be writing. I love podcasting and being on TV and a lot of the other stuff too, but I love writing the most. And so when I was an attorney, I ended up being a transactional attorney, and I drafted contract and deal documents all all day. And then I moved into sports business and I was writing articles all day. And in another part of my life, we won't spend a lot of time on here, I write romance novels. And so I love to write. And every job I've ever had that I've loved from the time I was a teenager has involved writing. And so I think about that as I take on new opportunities or get offered new things. Would I be able to continue to pursue the thing that I love the most, which is writing?
Absolutely. And do you think aspiring young sports professionals should kind of tap into their strengths? Like, how important is it to reflect on things that you enjoy, the things that you're good at,
I tell
especially
people
going
all
into the
the
sports industry?
time, yeah, try to figure out the tasks you enjoy doing. Like I end up speaking to sports management students a lot. I teach in sports management at University of Florida and I lecture a lot at other schools. And students tell me they want to go work for a certain team or they want to, work in the NBA or whatever it is. And I grew up, my biggest dream was working for the Atlanta Braves. That is all I wanted growing up. I wanted to be the general manager of the Braves one day. I guess it could still happen, but I think I'm on a different path now. But I think that sometimes you get so focused on who you want to work for that you don't think about what you actually enjoy doing. So,
100%.
for example, I thought at one point I wanted to be an agent, and then I went and shadowed an agent for a week. I was lucky enough that a guy I knew in high school got drafted by the Braves when I was in law school, and it took about 2 days for me to figure out that I do not want to be an agent, that there's nothing about that job that actually appeals to me. Like, I would enjoy the contract negotiation, but that is such a tiny piece of what agents do. So I think you have to figure out what the tasks you enjoy doing instead of getting focused on a job title or a certain employer. And once I started doing that and started focusing on doing the thing I love, which for me is writing, but for other people could be different things, that opened up a lot of new avenues and helped me say no to things that were sort of like bright and shiny and seemed exciting. And in fact, I just got a job offer in my email the other day, and my first instinct was like, oh my God, that would be such a cool job to say that I had. That would look awesome on my resume. And then I started thinking about it and I was like, I would hate that job. There's actually nothing about the day to day of that job I would enjoy.
Yeah.
So I think you got to kind of drop the idea of a certain job title or a certain employer and chase the thing you like to do.
Yeah, so kind of going a little deeper into your passion for contract negotiations, you were someone that was very early in the space of NIL, kind of writing even in 2019 about the potential impacts that it could have. What led you to want to be kind of a thought leader in that space?
Yeah, so early on in my writing career, the Ed O'Bannon trial happened. It was one of the first things I wrote about because I was a lawyer, so I was interested in the trial. And for those who are too young to remember what that trial was all about, Ed O'Bannon believed his image and likeness were being used in the EA Sports college basketball game. And he sued and wanted, he actually didn't want to he didn't ask for payment for it. But he did ask that EA Sports not be allowed to use the name, image, or likeness of athletes until such a time that the NCAA would allow them to be compensated for it, which, flash forward and here we are. But that was something I covered early in my career. And so I feel like all along I have followed these efforts for student athletes to receive more compensation. It started with unlimited meals, and then it was cost of attendance. And then there were Alston Awards, and now we have name, image, and likeness. And soon we're going to have revenue sharing. So from the time I started reporting on college sports, to me, the Ed O'Bannon trial was the beginning of all this. People who've covered it longer can tag things that happened even earlier than that. But for me, like, it started with that. And so I was always keeping my eye on it. And when California passed for state law for NIL, I'm trying to remember if that was end of 2019. I think it was into 2019 or beginning of 2020 when that happened. I actually went to an SEO coach. I've had this site, the Business of College Sports. It's just businessofcollegesports.com. I've had it since I was a lawyer. I created it. I remember sitting at my desk in my law office in 2010, creating the site, and I've had it all these years. And I went to this SEO coach and I said, I want my site to be like the place on the internet for people to learn about name, image, and likeness. I'm like, I have the knowledge, but I need you to help me figure out like the back end and how do I make sure I rank for it on Google. And so I worked with her all through 2020 during the pandemic when I was stuck at home and couldn't go anywhere. And so I was ready when 2021 happened and the rules changed. I had already been working on it for 18 months at that point because I knew it was coming and I wanted to be able to help educate athletes on how they could maximize their opportunities.
So you mentioned that you see the next step in the process being a shift to a revenue sharing model. Can you kind of break that down to the casual viewer who doesn't understand kind of where things are going and how that would kind of operate for universities and how they would go about that and how it would impact both major sports as well as non-revenue generating sports?
Yeah, so that's going to be the result of a lawsuit, actually several lawsuits. But the one thing that people hear about all the time is the House case. Grant House was a college swimmer, and there's a number of other athletes who joined together with him, both past and current student athletes. And they were seeking a few things. What they're getting is there is some back pay going to former student athletes who didn't have the opportunity to monetize their NIL because they played before the NIL rules changed. And then also there's some new policy affecting current student athletes. We're actually waiting right now for the for the settlement to be approved. That hearing is in early April of 2025, and we'll know whether this is going to happen. However, everyone has been moving forward as if this settlement is going to happen, and part of that settlement allows for schools to share revenue with athletes. The number for the first year is $20.5 million. It's based on a calculation of revenue. I believe it's 22% of certain revenue categories within the Power Four conferences, was the Power Five at the beginning of the lawsuit. So you see it referred to both ways, but basically schools will have the opportunity to opt in and decide that they want to participate in revenue sharing. And then they can be anywhere on the spectrum from $0 to $20.5 million. So some schools might decide, hey, we're only doing $2.5 million and we're going to focus on just our men's basketball team. Or a school might decide we're doing 20.5, we're going to do football, men's basketball, women's basketball, baseball, and softball. Every school's going to do it differently, presumably, but we do believe the vast majority of the money will go to football and men's basketball. That's because the majority of the revenue comes from football and men's basketball. And so sort of the biggest questions left are whether Title IX it requires for there to be equitable payments made on the male and female side, which is, we could do a whole hour just on that. But I will tell you that right now, schools are largely planning to share, I would say most Power Four schools are planning to share 75 to 85% with football, 10 to 15% with men's basketball, and then a little bit with a couple of other sports, but it'll vary greatly from one school to the next.
Gotcha. And actually, that's a really interesting point. So at A&M, we have a program called Amplify U, which is available to student athletes. Are you familiar with it?
I am a little bit, yeah.
Gotcha. Just for some context, kind of like provide student athletes with like invaluable resources, branding opportunities, like some financial literacy and other like career development stuff. So in your view, how important are these kind of initiatives in the future for, helping shape the future of these athletes and with having positive impact in their life, making sure they know, kind of like what are the right steps to navigate from university, specifically when they're freshmen, before they graduate, even if they don't go pro?
It's a lot to learn and navigate. In fact, I run a Facebook group full of parents of athletes. It's largely the parents of high school athletes, and I have 1,000 of them in there right now. And they ask some of the same questions about like, how do I get started? How do I protect my athlete? Because there are a lot of different issues out there. There are agents, and if you can't see me, I'm doing that in air quotes because there is no registration required. There is no certification. Anyone can call themselves an NIL agent. You too can walk out the door when we get done with this and start telling everybody you're NIL agents. I mean, that's how easy it is. You just say you are one. And so student athletes really need to vet the people they're signing with. And I spend a lot of time educating student athletes on that. In fact, I have an entire chapter on my book that is just on this because I feel so passionately about it. I've been represented by 2 broadcast agents and 2 literary agents over the last decade. I've had good and bad experiences, and I've seen athletes now have good and bad experiences. And so there's a lot of education that needs to be done around that, but also a lot of education around, the tax liability they're going to have for doing these brand deals, and a lot of education around potentially, running your own business, having your own LLC, protecting your trademarks and your name. A lot of education needs to happen around contracts because athletes are signing contracts without having anybody review them. And often they're giving away rights they don't even realize they're giving away. And some of it they're giving away in perpetuity, which means forever. So they're really, heavy implications for this in an athlete's future, particularly if they go pro or grow their personal brand beyond just being a college athlete. So it's a lot for athletes to learn and to manage on top of going to school, on top of playing their sport. It's a lot to put on people and a lot to put on their parents because a lot of the parents are the ones who are trying to help them figure all this out. So I do think it's really important for schools to have educational programs. And it's one of the number one complaints I hear from college athletes is that they say their school is not providing them the education they want around these things. Now, that being said, some of them, I know their schools and their schools are offering it. They're just not taking advantage of it. But I think some of it too is athletic departments figuring out how to meet the athletes where they are. What do they want? Do they want speakers to come in? Do they want little modules they can do on their phone when they're on their run? Like, I think some of it is the industry figuring figuring out how do we get the knowledge to the athletes. But it is super important moving forward, especially because with revenue sharing, we're talking about even more money than we've had with NIL.
So, in your time researching for your book, what would you say is the biggest surprise? You hit on some things a little bit earlier, but what do you say is the biggest surprise that you think maybe the average person doesn't understand surrounding kind of the contract negotiations and deals that these athletes are signing?
Yeah, I would say the biggest one actually happened in a workshop I did a couple of weeks ago for my parents' Facebook group. And actually, now I'm putting it into the book because it happened in the workshop. And I had an attorney join me, and he has been looking at negotiating a lot of the new revenue sharing contracts. Because even though that hasn't started yet, the recruiting class that coaches are out there currently signing in a number of sports, but especially in football, they're getting these revenue sharing contracts already because revenue sharing is supposed to begin July 1st of 2025. So that means incoming freshmen for 2025 can potentially be earning revenue share. So the contracts are already going out, and this is something no one's ever seen before. The athletes haven't seen this before, attorneys haven't seen this before. It's brand new. And so I brought him into the group to talk about some of the contracts he's been seeing. And I was actually really surprised to find out how many schools are asking for the right to the athlete's NIL forever. And sometimes exclusively, meaning that the athletes won't be able to work with anyone other than the people the school connects the athlete with. But it's mostly the ability to use their name, image, and likeness forever. So if they go on and they become a big NFL player, MLB player, NBA, whatever it is, or they go on and maybe they become, I don't know, a Pulitzer Prize winner. I mean, maybe it's not even anything to do with sports, but somehow their personal brand grows as they leave college. The school still has the right to use their name, image, and likeness forever and with no additional compensation to that person down the road based on how these contracts are structured. So I was actually really surprised by a number of terms, not just that one, but a number of terms that are really overreaching in these. But maybe the even bigger surprise is that when I asked the attorney, are schools willing to negotiate this? Like when you push back on it on behalf of an athlete, are they changing things? And he said, oh yeah, like hardly anyone has said no when we push back. And that's interesting because now you're going to have players who are on the same team where some of them hired an attorney to look at the revenue sharing contract and they got changes made that restrict them from the transfer portal or keep their NIL forever. I mean, there's a number of different things. Some of them are going to have those things negotiated out because they worked with an attorney who got those things out of their contract. Maybe the teammate right next to them in the line didn't do it. They just signed it. It was a lot of money. They got super excited. They saw all the zeros. They signed. They didn't hire an attorney. And now they have all those clauses in their contract. So you're going to have guys on the same team who are operating under totally different rules. And I like that. It's going to be a mess.
Yeah, so with that mess, do you see that mess kind of stabilizing in the next few years, or do you kind of see it continually regressing into more confusion and problems?
I do think it'll get better because athletes will start to talk to each other and they'll become aware that, different guys got different things. And hopefully they will then start going to attorneys and agents more to negotiate these things. And we'll see some standardization across the contracts. That happened with NIL collectives in 2021, 2022, when the NIL collectives were first starting up. Some of their contracts were horrific for the athletes. However, it sort of evened out over time because they got called out publicly, they got written about in an article, or just people wouldn't sign with them anymore, And so it got to where the contract became far more standard and it looked pretty similar from one school to the next. So I think you'll see some of that with revenue sharing. And I also think that there's a future, maybe not that far away, where some of these athletes will be considered employees and they will be under a standard employment contract in the professional leagues. There are form contracts that are used across the league. And I think that's what we will see if we have this movement to employment.
Yeah. And so kind of going off of that, Kristi, if you had a magic wand and you could address any of these issues that we've been talking about with the current NIL landscape, what would you fix? What would you do? What would you change?
That's really hard. I find the employment situation messy for a number of reasons because without getting too in the weeds, there are sort of different rules for private institutions institutions versus public institutions. About half of the states don't allow employees of public institutions to unionize. So you could have a situation where athletes at private schools have the ability to unionize and athletes at public schools don't. There are some ways around that are too much for us to get into here, but that's a potential concern. And maybe an even bigger one that no one is talking about is what happens to international student athletes. There are tens of thousands of international student athletes across every sport. And I've talked to immigration attorneys. This is not my area of law, but I've talked to immigration attorneys about this. And it is a real problem, not only with employment, but actually with revenue sharing too. But international student athletes can't just become employees of the institution. It would require a totally different visa. Immigration attorneys have told me it would be difficult for college athletes to get another kind of visa. And so you're looking at a situation that would probably take years to resolve as far as the ability for international athletes to play on teams if employment comes. And so I would not get into all that employment mess. So going on that immigration route, I think my magic wand moment would probably be to get something from the federal government relative to international student athletes, because right now they don't have the same NIL opportunities that their teammates do. They don't have the same revenue sharing opportunities, and they wouldn't be able to participate as employees. So I think maybe that's my magic wand issue.
Absolutely. And kind of working on that issue and some of the other ones that we have also discussed, do you think there is an opportunity for kind of like a stabilizing body or maybe even like a figure, like a CEO or maybe a commissioner that could like kind of take lead on all of these issues that we've been talking about?
Yeah, there have been a lot of models proposed, particularly for college football pulling away from the NCAA and being managed separately. There have also been proposals for the Power Four pulling away and being managed separately. I would say the football proposals have more legs maybe at this point, and there have been discussions about what a CEO of college football would look like. The college football playoff is already outside of the NCAA. They are a completely separate entity that manages the postseason for football. And so it's not unimaginable that you could sort of pull football out. What that looks like, I've seen a number of different proposals, even some where the athletes aren't students anymore, that college football is totally pulled away and pays licensing rights to the colleges to use their colors and logos and pays fees to use their stadium, but they're not actually students at the institution anymore. Teams could be owned privately. It's super interesting, some of the models that have been put forward. I think those are all a possibility, but it's not something I think is going to happen imminently. I think we're a little ways away from that. I mean, it took like 15 years to get here with NIL, so I don't think this is something that's happening in the next year or two, but I think it's a real possibility.
Yeah, so we've kind of asked you to use your magic wand in previous question. Now with your crystal ball, what do you see kind of happening in just the next 5 to 10 years? As you said, you think that further shift away from the NCAA might take a little longer than that.
Yeah, I mean, I still think the employment question, I mean, I've been writing about that for 15 years. We saw Northwestern football student athletes try to unionize previously. Now we've seen Dartmouth men's basketball try to unionize. Those efforts for different reasons haven't moved forward, but there's legs there. I mean, Dartmouth actually, the men's basketball players got a positive ruling in their favor.
Yeah.
However, now they have dismissed it. Part of that is because of the current administration they don't believe would be friendly towards college athletes unionizing. So that could come back around if there's a change of administration in 4 years. So a lot of it depends on the political atmosphere, frankly, especially on that employment and unionization side. I do still feel like it's coming. We've been talking about it for at least the 15 years that I've been reporting in this space. And so I think the momentum for it has been growing, although slowly. It opens its own can of worms. And I'm not saying that I'm personally like championing it, but I've been watching it all these years and it has gained steam. But it's also not something I think is happening over the next 4 years in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And these kind of changes that are coming are certainly going to be monumental and have an impact on people from across the country. And kind of the root of that impact at the end of the day is the magnitude of college sports. So kind of zooming back out, can you tell us about a little bit more about Saturday Millionaires and kind of how you analyze the impact that college sports have?
Great name, by the way.
Yes, thank you. It's funny because I came up with the name before I had actually decided to write the book. I remember I lived in Atlanta
Yeah.
at the time, and I know exactly what road I was driving on. And I thought of
Yeah.
the title, and I was like, "I really like that. I should write a book." So the point of that book was I learned a lot about the business side of college sports and college football in particular from the time I was a fan until I became a sports business reporter. I was in law school at the University of Florida when Urban Meyer and Tim Tebow were there, so they won one national championship while I was there, another the year after I left. We also won two basketball championships while I was there. And so I got to see
Wow.
firsthand the
What a
impact that it was a crazy time to be there. I did not grow up a Florida Gator fan. Nobody in my family really was, but it was hard not to become one when you're there at that time and they're winning all these championships. And I always tell people if I had not gone to Florida, I had also gotten into Emory and I was trying to decide which one to go to. If I got
oh
to Emory,
wow.
maybe I would have never been a sports business reporter because it was watching what happened in Gainesville with those championships that made me interested in the business side of college sports because I saw how it
Yeah.
impacted the town. I saw how it impacted applications and enrollment and all these things that happen when you have a championship team and when you have multiple championship teams over multiple years. That's obviously magnified. And so I just became fascinated in it and sort of self-taught myself all these things about legal and business issues in college sports over a number of years. And so the book was my way of showing fans like, here's what you don't know about the game. Here's what happens behind the scenes. Like I remember the day that I found out that really only football and men's basketball make any money and that all the other sports lose money and football and men's basketball fund them. No one was writing that back then. I mean, that's maybe something fans are aware of now, but
Right.
back then no one talked about that. No one realized the amount of money that was lost. Or I remember sitting in an NCAA session at a conference and their CFO was up there and she was putting up all the different championship events that they host in all three divisions. But even in Division One, and I just checked this a couple of years ago and it was still true, only five championships make money for the NCAA. Off the top of my head, I remember that it's wrestling, hockey, men's basketball, and now I'm not going to remember what the other two are, but I remember they were kind of surprising. But that's it,
Baseball?
five sports that make money and the rest all lose money. And so they're subsidized by the ones that make money. And
Mhm.
like, it's just not stuff I knew as a fan. So the book was really about sort of opening the doors. I had been on dozens of college campuses at that point. I had poured over the finances of hundreds of schools. And so the book was really just showing fans like, here's what happens behind the scenes.
That's
Yeah, fantastic. Sounds like kind of what we're trying to do here and kind of spread the awareness and, go down the rabbit hole to uncover the true impact of sports for sure.
Yeah,
no,
and now it's like a history book because that book was published in 2013. And some things haven't changed, but certainly the dollar amounts have changed. And like conference television networks were just becoming a thing as the book was being published. So I think Big Ten Network and SEC Network,
yeah.
and then maybe Longhorn Network were the only ones that existed when the book went to print. But like to see the evolution of the TV contracts and to see the college football playoff come around, now the book is kind of outdated.
Yeah, and I kind of, as we're transitioning into our end here, I'm really curious to see what your answer would be to this. But obviously, we want to spread advice for student athletes, universities, and businesses navigating like NIL. If you were a parent, I mean, you're in those communities, as you said. If you were a parent, that was helping your kid navigate, what to do with NIL, how would you approach that directly?
Well, I just asked somebody earlier today. I was talking to someone at IMG Academy, and I was asking them, how they help advise parents how to navigate this space. And there aren't a lot of like comprehensive resources right now, which is actually why I wrote my new book, The Athletes NIL Playbook, because there's
Yeah.
information out there, but it's sort of scattered. Like you might get a little bit from this website, and a little bit from this website, and you can watch this webinar and maybe take this little mini course. But it's like all little pieces of the puzzle. So to get everything, it would take a lot of time and research. And so I tried to do that for athletes and parents instead and kind of distill that all down into one place with my book, mostly because I am constantly looking for resources for people and shooting them links or sharing things in my group. And it's easier for me to have it all in one place. So
Right.
I sort of wrote the book for myself too. But I do think it requires a lot of proactive searching by parents to find everything they need to navigate this.
Absolutely. And so when is your book launching? What's the name? If you want to say it again, and where can people get access to it when it does come out?
It will be out July 2nd, but it's currently already on pre-order, so you can go ahead and reserve a copy. It's called The Athlete's NIL Playbook, and it's meant for both athletes and their parents, whether they're at the youth high school level or they're already in college. And it covers everything from kind of personal branding basics, like what should be in your bio so brands can find you, what kind of content should you be posting to get more deals, what are the other ways you can make NIL money if you don't like social media. I think I highlighted like 20 different ways college athletes are making money, and social media is only one of those ways. So there's lots of other ways. And I highlighted athletes that are writing books, athletes that are artists who are selling their art now. I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff that athletes have been able to do thanks to NIL. And then I cover things like contract terms to look out for, questions to ask agents before you hire them, things we're seeing pop up with revenue sharing you need to have on your radar or make sure aren't in your contract. So I try to be as comprehensive as possible so that parents and athletes can navigate this space and, hold on to their rights and make as much money as they can.
Kristi, thank you so much for all of your insights. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, I want to ask you one final personal question. I see in the back you have some A&M, some Auburn, and some Florida merchandise. How would you rank these three teams kind of heading into the next football season?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I would like to say that I would rank Florida on top of that. That remains to be seen.
My boy DJ.
Florida and A&M, I feel pretty good that both could have a great season. Auburn, maybe not so much. And my husband's not here to hear me say that. He's the Auburn grad.
So how did you guys meet? Did you guys kind of meet in a sports context?
We did actually. He was in sports talk radio. He was a producer and was also on air on a show in Atlanta. And I was practicing law in Atlanta at the time, but writing about sports on the side. And I was doing some TV work at a regional sports network. And the guys he was on the radio with did TV with me, but I didn't know my husband, Chad. And I pitched myself to be on their show because I would go on radio shows and do segments about sports business. And so I pitched him, and I always joke they never had me on still. But we kind of got in a Twitter, not argument, but disagreement over something one day. And he went back and found the email where I had pitched myself, and he emailed me and asked if I wanted to go have a drink to talk about it more. And that was 15 years ago, and we're still together.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a great story. And Kristi, we lied to you. Actually, I do have one more question for you. Kind of, do you want to, kind of put just a closing statement, any last pieces of advice, to somebody who, is thinking about going to the sports industry, somebody who's navigating it, like somebody that like might even be in it right now? What's the best way to make, the best of it, but while also enjoying having a great time in it?
Yeah, we talked about connections earlier. It's so important. You might have heard the saying that it's not about who you know, it's who knows you. And that really is true. It's about making those connections. And I would say doing internships in the space. It is almost impossible to get a job in sports if you haven't done internships. And I've heard advice given, if you don't work for free while you're in college, you'll have to work for free after college. And in sports, that is true because there are a lot of people willing to work in this space for free because they want to, make a career transition into it. So those internships are super important. But when you're there doing the internship, meet with as many people as you can. Like if you only work in one department, ask to have lunch or sit down with people in other departments and just meet as many people as you can meet while you're there. And then do your best to stay in touch with the ones you feel like you connected the best with.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Kristi, so much. And in classic A&M fashion, the last thing I promise that we're going to ask you to do is to, if you want to send good bull to anybody, good bull means, a shout out, or send good luck to, who would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say it would be to all the Aggies that welcomed me my first year. I was telling you guys before we hit record, I came to A&M for the first time fall of 2011 when they were making the move from the Big 12 to the SEC. And I just tweeted out that I was on campus, and I got invited to so many tailgates over Twitter. And I ended up going with a group who at the time I think was called the Wrecking Crew, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And then the group sort of splintered and it became a lot of different groups. And I had a group that I followed around. But I would have to say there is a woman named Diane that I became very good friends with, and I tailgated with every single year from 2011 till basically current day, who has welcomed me. And it just, although I'm a Gator at heart, I love coming to games at A&M because it is the best fans. It is the nicest people, and I love being there on game day.
Oh, well, that means a lot. Kristi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.